about for the first time.
Yes, this has not been released as of yet. And so I hope everyone's seeing the slides.
Yep, we can see. Go for it.
All right. So we're in a democratic emergency. And let's talk about the numbers that prove that. The first kind of number I want to stick in everyone's head is 24.7 million. That is the estimated amount of views that we have seen on misinformation claiming voter fraud in just 4 swing states. And these are just 10 fact-checked false claims and 50 posts. So if we talk about just in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida, just looking at 10 fact-checked false claims amongst hundreds, the scale of, in those states that are decided by a small margin of swing voters, over 20 million estimated views is terrifying. These are claims such as the Postal Service is using collection box locks to suppress voters, or that certain votes are being thrown in the garbage. And although these are all pieces of misinformation in this sample that have been fact-checked by Facebook partners, 37% of them are still not labeled by Facebook. And the millions of people who have seen this misinformation that's meant to divide and in many cases meant to suppress votes are not getting the corrections directly. So when we looked at that content just for this sample and we saw how viral it was on Facebook despite the promises, we asked ourselves, how big is this problem really? And we have a poll. We ran a poll with Survey USA, a leading pollster in 9 different swing states and nationally. And we'll release the poll results within the next 24 hours for those interested. But I want to just speak to 2 examples and look at Pennsylvania as a case study, because it's been in the news a lot. In Pennsylvania, when we asked voters, have you seen the claim that mail-in voting will lead to more voter fraud? 86% of registered voters said that they had seen that claim. And 72% in Pennsylvania had said that they had seen that specific claim on Facebook.
So nearly 3/4 of all voters in Pennsylvania say they've seen these claims on Facebook.
Yeah, for those who have seen them, yes, they say that they've seen them on Facebook. But this is the most terrifying thing. Honestly, this shook us when we saw these results. For those who say that they've seen this misinformation repeated more than once, 63% said that most often they've seen it repeated on Facebook. And 35% believe that this claim was true. Now, let's just think about that in the context of the elections within a few weeks. This poll was run in the last 2 weeks. The fact that so many Americans have seen these lies and many believe them in this context calls this a democratic emergency. And many, Facebook particularly, when we show them this data, they say, yes, but this claim has also been amplified on cable news and on other places and by the president and so forth. So we decided, we looked at 10 different other claims, many of which are only present on social media. Here's one claim that we've seen going viral in the last few weeks, and it is that Joe Biden is a pedophile. Again, for Pennsylvania voters, 51% say that they have seen it, 73% has also been amplified. And I'm hearing an echo. Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
All right. So 73% said that they have seen it on Facebook, and 53% they had most often, if it's been repeated, it's been most often repeated on Facebook. As you see, the number of people who think that it is true is also equally high. So over 50 million. This is where we go to algorithmic amplification. And here, Facebook said that for the New York Post story on Hunter Biden, that they had demoted the link. And a lot of people took that as sacred, as true. But when we went and looked at how much that link was shared and how many people viewed it, we found that within the first 16 to 24 hours, it had over 50 million projected views. And how were these views achieved? Well, our analysis put together a data set of thousands of Facebook groups and pages that systematically share misinformation, that in the last few months have shared more than 3 pieces of independently fact-checked misinformation in the context of the US. And these serial misinformers, we found about over 200 pages that specifically amplified this story, and they had a total audience of 13 million followers. And if we look, Facebook has promised that it is reducing the reach of serial misinformers and super spreaders. They've said they're working hard since what happened in 2016, but the data indicates something different. Here's another number, 4.25 times. This graph shows those same pages, the serial misinformers that amplified this story, their reach ahead of the 2016 election. That's the blue line below. And the line above it is their reach, the amount of interactions they're getting in this year in the last 12 months ahead of these elections. As you can see, they've had about 4 times as much interactions, views between now and 2016. This is terrifying, and it seems like Facebook's algorithm is amplifying misinformation and defeating Facebook's own policies, or Facebook is just not being honest with us. And I will end here. For everyone listening, there is a solution. Facebook could detox its algorithm. It could demote these bad actors so they reach 80% less people, and it could provide retroactive corrections to individuals that see this misinformation. In 2016, Facebook said it was an accident. Mark Zuckerberg apologized dozens of times. Are we going to accept another Zuckerberg apology? In this moment, in this democratic emergency, we can't do that. The platform needs to act. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Fadi. So I just want to get a few of those numbers, just reinforce them. So that New York Post story, we're talking over 50 million people would have seen that. And with the 2016 to 2020, so those numbers, just so people are really clear. So these are organizations that were spreading misinformation in 2016. So we have 4 years to realize they were doing that. Facebook's promises were working to demote them, but instead they're reaching 4 times as many people in 2020.
Yes.
That's absolutely shocking. And I want to turn to Safia Noble now. And just, Safia, I just want to ask you, does this surprise you?
It really doesn't, Kyle. I have to say that this data really confirms the things that we know about the way in which algorithms amplify the worst, most titillating, often racist and sexist and fraudulent kinds of disinformation. We know that this is indeed the model for social media companies and for Facebook specifically, who profits incredibly off of a business model of engagement. And that engagement is predicated upon any kind of so-called content moving through its platform. It's really unfortunate that the executives at Facebook really prefer to make trillions of dollars, quite frankly, off the backs of collapsing democracy, because indeed this is what we are seeing happen. We are seeing a company that puts profits before people, before fair elections, that is weaponized to indeed engage in voter suppression. And I think this is really a wake-up call. I mean, this data that is being provided here is confirmation, once again, of the incredible harms that are coming from this sector that has no accountability, no oversight, takes no responsibility. I just think an apology is deeply insufficient when you have a business model, again, that is predicated upon the amplification of any kind of information or disinformation or propaganda for profit. And this is has incredible consequences. I mean, one of the things that I know from my own research is that who pays the highest price are the most vulnerable in our society. Who pays the greatest price are the people who are turned away from the voter polls who are discouraged from voting, who are discouraged from even believing in this fragile experiment of democracy. And I think that we've got to take very seriously at every level of our society the consequences, the grave consequences for the spread of disinformation and propaganda, and the way in which people act upon it, whether that's using Facebook to organize white militias and white supremacists to actively participate in voter intimidation and voter suppression and harm, taking down civil rights activists and leaders. We've seen that. We see Facebook actively engaged in providing the platform and the resources for that kind of activity in this country and beyond, all the way to using the platform to generate calls for genocide against vulnerable people around the world. And I just think that this is alarming. We are in a high state of crisis and we must have some action.
Thank you, Safi. Yeah, on that point about genocide and the bigger questions around this as well, I want to ask Ruha, actually, is this new? Is this something that's sort of suddenly happened, or what's the context here that we're working under?
Sure. Should Shireen, you want me to jump in, or shall I? Did you want to go? Oh, I can't hear you.
Shireen looks to be on mute, so why don't you go ahead first?
Okay, sure. So good afternoon, everyone. So I want to build. Okay, thanks. So I want to build on the important statements of my colleagues so far by invoking the words of this nation's most tireless champion of voting rights. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I think any discussion of voter suppression requires that we call on the spirit of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, because a crucial part of the context in which we're having this discussion is intergenerational exhaustion. In 2020, we continue to witness people still waiting hours and hours in line to cast their ballots, people threatened with armed militia standing guard at polling places, and we witness that Black people are one of the main targets of digital voter suppression campaigns, as Shireen will share with us in just a moment. If Ms. Hamer were alive today, I think her ire would surely be directed at the machinations of digital platforms that invoke the language of free speech and social connection in order to fracture and disempower people. And I suspect she would find it no surprise that Black Americans have been one of the prime targets of digital voter suppression, because the Black vote has always been a threat to the powers that be. Black people, after all, are the conscience of this country. We have believed in the democratic possibilities of this nation, even when this nation has done everything in its power to suppress our ability not only to vote, but to work, to go to school, to simply live. My colleague, Patricia J. Williams, put it best. To say that Blacks never fully believed in rights is true. Yet it is also true that Blacks believed in them so much and so hard that we gave them life where there was none before. We held on to them, put the hope of them into our wombs, mothered them, not just the notion of them. We nurtured rights and gave rights life. This is how I see our work as a board. We're not simply concerned about Facebook adhering to its own policies to protect this particular election, which should already be a given. Rather, we're trying against all odds to nurture rights and give them life. If Ms. Hamer were alive, I think she would remind us that in her day, the people who pulled her over after registering to vote threw her into a jail cell and beat her so violently that she was left with lifelong injuries. Those people were animated by venomous hate and were threatened by her demand to be a first-class citizen. But today, she would observe that when it comes to Facebook's central role in voter suppression, we're confronted by something more than the flaming hate of white supremacists. The cool indifference and greed of executives hiding behind buzzwords and business as usual. Facebook tells us they're in the business of connecting people, which by now we know is a euphemism for growth by any means necessary. In Mark Zuckerberg's own words, scaling and growth are everything. Individuals and their experiences are secondary to what is necessary to maximize the system. For Facebook, it doesn't seem to matter that the platform connects people to militia groups to carry out violence, as our board discussed last week, because that's growth. For Facebook, it doesn't seem to matter that the platform connects people to lies that systematically suppress voter turnout, because that's growth. This zealous pursuit of growth is Facebook's religion, one that demands that democracy be sacrificed on the altar of capitalism. This religion uses the language of connecting people like a mystical chant, but connection is not a straightforward good. The point is that we can't emphasize enough as a board. Facebook is not simply ignoring or looking away from the harm facilitated by its platform. The company is profiting from it. This is part of a long tradition of racial capitalism, in which racism doesn't simply harm and exclude its targets, it also enriches and empowers its perpetrators. Racism is productive and Facebook is reaping the benefit. The only way for us to put a stop to it is to really connect people in the tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer, and together demand the enforcement of policies that uphold truth and protect the rights of those who, generation after generation, have had to petition for our most basic rights.
That was incredible and so poignant and hit, yes, so many notes, and I'm deeply, deeply moved by it. And I want to ask Shireen if she can just go straight to following up on that point and talk about the community perspective and just, what is happening.
I am so honored not only to be on this panel, but honored to follow Ruha and the breadth and depth of that story of Fannie Lou Hamer and the likes of our communities. But I also want to make sure that I don't miss the part about what this whole general perspective of what Facebook has done to communities across the globe, right? When we talk about these genocides that happened, we saw that the ways in which Facebook had allowed organizing those who were willing to commit harm and incite violence against specific groups, whether it was from Myanmar, whether it was here in America with Kenosha, where people reported and basically tried to get their attention and they ignored the voices of the voiceless. They amplify those who are willing to incite harm and decide that they want to use the platforms to amplify that harm. And even Facebook had decided in some form of their moderation process to include white nationalism into the moderation process because they consider that different than white supremacists. Also understanding that the moderation process in the beginning of this platform had always been created to organize that white men were the most protected class over a Black child. These are the things of which that is not new about the platform. These are the things of which that we're still dealing with the way in the way in which Russia had interfered in the election, using the platform as the purpose of the platform to amplify information, i.e. disinformation, for a targeted purpose, for a targeted group. The ways in which we now know that even political campaigns from a domestic perspective have done the exact same thing and continue to target marginalized groups on issues like immigration, but communities in general, i.e. voter suppression that Black communities have had to deal with since before Jim Crow. We are now in, I don't even want to go into the details, but Ruha's book even speaks to most of this, but we are now in the digital version of the Jim Crow that we are watching on these platforms right now. So when we go into the details of what was revealed in these exposés, where that you can go into county levels and details of quote unquote deterrence for certain groups of people that were already happening on these platforms that the platforms themselves had ignored. And even Facebook themselves had already created a system that made this possible, despite their terms of services, despite the ways in which they were supposed to counter these aspects, despite the fact that they were supposed to allow the most marginalized voices to have equal space on their platforms. They spent enormous energy, which we have tracked the data of, trying to silence those who were speaking up against racism, speaking up against sexism, speaking up against ableisms and all isms that existed on their platforms. And they were seen as the violent ones, and they were silenced, banned, and suspended against those who were basically using and inciting and then targeting these marginalized groups, who were giving full reign until present day. And even now we're watching with this data set that's coming out, that is just being reported, but data sets that we have all looked at, where those who are inciting the violence, committing the harms, and trying to get people out to be harmful to others are being given more access on the platforms than those that are trying to combat it. And that is literally why we're having this problem now, and will continue to have, because Facebook refuses to use their even their own terms of service to do something different.
Well, and we hear these headlines, QAnon banned, and sort of big grand statements, but then we sort of see the evidence that I always say, like, the fourth paragraph, which is, oh, actually, but it's not quite working, or it's not actually what we mean, and so we know that, like, the promises made in the past, haven't been delivered on, and so it's difficult to think that we can trust in future commitments. But I do want to ask everybody, what do they need to do? What does Facebook need to do? And I want to take it a step further afterwards, but I want to know now, what does Facebook need to do? Sapia?
Well, I think we've seen the, Real Facebook Oversight Board put forward some very specific recommendations about the way in which disinformation should not be allowed to flourish with respect to the election that we're just days away from. And I think that the articulations of the board should be taken seriously. The whole existence of this board is because Facebook promised, after the evidence was mounting of election interference that Facebook actively supported and engaged in 2016. It promised it would look more deeply into this. And, here we are on October 22nd, and their oversight board just convened for the first time in 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, this is unacceptable, right? So I think we have to take seriously the calls that are being put forward by critics, by journalists, by researchers, by people who have all of the receipts to show the way in which the Black vote is being suppressed, the way the platform is being weaponized to actually incite violence against Black communities too. Let's not forget that we already see an active organization of voter intimidation against poor people and Black people in the United States, directly tied to the upcoming presidential election in terms of not accepting whatever the outcome of the vote is. So I think we have a lot at stake right now. And when I say we have a lot at stake, I'm not talking just philosophically about democracy. I'm talking about people's lives, people being hurt, people being shot, people being damaged in a variety of different ways. And we've got to be very serious about this. And maybe Facebook should be shut down between now and the election. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could take this very seriously.
Does anyone go ahead, Shireen? Yeah.
So from my perspective, like to piggyback on what we are demanding from the oversight board is one thing, but the aspect of, like, what can Facebook do? They actually have the tools. Like I say this all the time, they're the ones that can fix this, because they're the ones that sees what's happening on their platforms. What they're deciding to do is the actions that they're taking, and what their actions are taking that we're seeing is that they are taking actions to say that the most marginalized voices are not important to them, and that they're willing to make money off of the harms against us. And that's problematic from a political ad perspective, which I think many of us have talked about this, what has happened in other countries, like shutting down political ads. Now, let me also be clear about what I say about these political ads. I'm talking about from campaigns, from politicians, from candidates, and from PACs. I am not talking about from individuals, organizations that are working for GOTV to get out the vote. Those people and those ads should not be shut down. They should not be classified as equivalent to the other groups. And that's the part of power dynamics. Those in office are operating from a completely different power dynamic than those who are voting, trying to cast their ballot, trying to get out the vote, and trying to make sure that their votes are not being suppressed. And I don't want people to misunderstand what we were asking for in those dynamics, because what we want is the voice of the people to be elevated over paid advertisement, millions of dollars, and political ads that will silence and target communities of color. And I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about the Black community. I'm also talking about the Native communities who have been targeted with disinformation, the Latinx community that have been targeted with disinformation, that we are looking at this from multiple aspects, including the apps that they have, WhatsApp and Instagram, that are literally having targeting Asian communities to go after silencing those who are pro Kamala because she happens to be Indian, from her Indian background and descent, another aspect of birtherism that impacts different communities differently. So what we're asking for is to ensure that there's elevation of those who are the most marginalized, and basically silencing these ad aspects, which is where Facebook makes their money, which Ruha talked about. Those are the ones they're giving elevation to, while silencing and punishing those who are speaking out against the government, i.e. the government being First Amendment rights. Your First Amendment right is to speak against the government when you disagree and that your life is being impacted. And I'm not talking about militias, and I'm not joining this fight around reopening, which people want to fight about the right to not wear masks to harm other Americans.
So let's just can Facebook be fixed? Let's just go to the meta question. I want to ask specifically about their board, which they launched today, in a second, and a few other things, but can Facebook be fixed? And specifically in the run-up to the election.
No, it can't. I mean, I think that the very minor demands that the real Facebook Oversight Board is asking for, which include things like banning events and groups for the purpose of harassment or inciting violence or disrupting voting activities, just a very, very basic kind of request like that can't even be implemented. So if Facebook can't implement quite simple recommendations, then the question is, should it exist when it is an organizing force for violence in our society too? So I think we've got to, ask ourselves some really tough questions about, this idea of media companies, quite frankly, being able to disseminate propaganda, again, at speed and scale, printing trillions of dollars, quite frankly, off the backs of the kinds of things that Ruha and Shireen are talking about. Should this be legal? Should media companies legally be able to do this kind of, engage in very clear consumer harm, and creating a lack of safety for consumers? Should that be allowed? Should that be legal? Probably not. So I think it's untenable, the current business model that Facebook has. And so we have to ask the questions as to whether it should exist.
So how could they prove themselves in the next 6 weeks, in the 2 weeks to the election, but perhaps even more importantly, the 4 weeks following? What could they do to prove themselves that they, are not going to be the reason that violence is widespread after polls close?
The one thing I would jump at here, Kyle, is to say there are kind of short-term, medium-term, and long-term things Facebook can do if there was the political will and leadership to transform itself from a company that's mostly doing harm to a company that is actually connecting and improving society. And those transformations need to happen at a foundational algorithmic level. But we're in a democratic emergency, and there are steps, if Facebook wants to prove that something has shifted inside the company, there are steps that this oversight board has called for. It can simply add friction to, for example, the worst super spreaders of misinformation. there's evidence that shows if Facebook actually takes that seriously, it can decrease by up to 80, sometimes 90%, the amount of people that are seeing misinformation or the amount of people that are seeing hateful content in their news feeds by adding different forms of friction. Facebook can begin more aggressively thinking forward, and instead of being reactive, looking at where are the clusters of the worst actors that are creating these pages and pursuing violence and acting against them to downrank them or take them down. Facebook can decide today to do retroactive correction so that even if they don't catch a piece of misinformation when it is first produced, once they catch it, once their fact checkers catch it, everyone who's seen it, who's been targeted with it, sees it. And those steps can prove that at least something changed within Facebook. And here, the question is, will Facebook's leadership, and we often speak about Mark Zuckerberg, but I want to say there are thousands of employees now at Facebook, and there are other leaders such as Guy Rosen, Monica Bicker, and others. The negligence this time falls on all of their shoulders because they can rebel, they can put pressure on the company, and they should be doing that in order to fix it within these 6 weeks because so much is at risk.
Thanks, Fuzzy. And just I want to get a few reactions to a few things before we finish today. You know, all of these things we talked about that they could be doing. I'll just tell you a few things that they did do today. There were reports that the political ad library broke today. Of course, this happened in the UK's general election last year. Several thousands of political ads got lost. And also there was a report that they ordered the NYU Ad Transparency Project to shut down. You know, how can they sort of, you know, balance the idea of change or the commitment to fixing stuff if this is how they're behaving? But the last thing I wanted to, their actual oversight board launched today. They said they're going to start taking decisions. We looked into the details of this. You know, their emergency facility, so if you say there's something really serious on Facebook, is 30 days. The normal timeline is 90. What do you all think of that? You know, is this oversight?
That's not very helpful. If the libraries that are supposed to be the resource for testing and checking the veracity of propaganda are not available, and if the emergency triage process takes 30 days and we're less than 30 days from the election, I guess we're just seeing more and more demonstration of the failure, right? So we have to take very seriously this pressure campaign on the company. And I think, you know, the other thing we want to remember is that the outcome of the elections will not be decided on election night. And it's going to be incredibly important what Facebook does in terms of amplifying disinformation that might be coming from all kinds of quarters until we have state verified and certified election results, which we know, in fact, may come days or weeks after election night. So we're in trouble right now if the public, and again, we want to remember that one of the reasons why Facebook has taken up so much oxygen in the information landscape is because, you know, they offshore their profits and they don't pay taxes, and they've really weakened all the democratic institutions that their tax revenues would go to support and bolster. Including investigative journalism and academia and public libraries. So, you know, I think we've got to pay attention to the strange coincidence, I guess, of the important resources that we need to help, again, provide fact-checking and truth-telling. And that means Facebook is, quite frankly, under more pressure to think about its role in the election outcome reporting.
Thank you, Safia. Ruha, Shireen, does anyone else want to comment on the mixed messaging today? Oh, we've set up our oversight board. Also, shut this transparency project down.
One more example of the double speak. Emergency is take your time is emergency. I think we're at the point where we can't accept any of the, you know, the veneer of change that they're putting forth. And so when you ask the question, can Facebook change? It really matters what we have in mind when we say Facebook. Is it just the platform? Is it the leadership, or is it this combination of leadership and the tools and that, you know, that we see causing all of this harm. And so certainly, as Shireen has pointed out and Fawzi has pointed out, it is straightforward to tweak or engage the tools and to change the algorithms and to, you know, address the disinformation from that level. But when the political leadership or where the executives are so entrenched in one sort of business model, even with those tools at their disposal, we're not going to see the change that's needed. And so this is the sort of demand for third-party independent oversight and protections. We can't count on Facebook to change itself with the current leadership that it has.
Thank you, Ruha. And on that, I just, go ahead,
sorry.
Shireen.
And
No, go ahead.
my only other addition to that is like there was a civil rights audit that was completed and Facebook decided to basically ignore it. So we do have a fundamental problem here. Like I want to make sure that people understand is like groups have been working with Facebook, even those that worked before worked with them before the Myanmar massacre, like that they were trying to work with them to ask them to sort of look at their policies, look at their actual actions versus what their policies say. And then there was a report that comes out with, I don't know, almost 80 pages worth, and their executives basically say they're going to ignore what those findings were. So as we are external looking at this and also probably hoping for a third party input, I think that parts of what our argument is that maybe the third party input is probably the government to talk about what we need to do to protect American citizens. Because at this point, if we do not have a broader conversation about this, and if they're not going to act, and if we're going to ask them to regulate themselves, they have proven to us over and over and over. I don't know, we did that video about how many times did he say, I'm sorry? Right? But the question now is, how many times do we have to see lives lost for us to act? Because if we're basically saying that politics and advertisement is more important than Americans and their lives, then I think we fundamentally have flawed they're fundamentally flawed. Let me say that as a company that was quote unquote American born in the tech industry in California.
So it's really about getting government to work for people again and not business. And I want to leave it there. You know, thank you, Fadi, so much for giving us this new research today, and Ruha, Safia, and Shireen for joining us. You've heard it. We're in a democracy emergency. The election is less than 2 weeks away. Facebook must act because it's a matter of life and death. Thank you very much.